Otto Preminger presents The Cardinal, the story of a young American, his personal and professional conflicts, starting with his ordination as a priest and ending with his elevation to Prince of the Church. Told against the background of 2 world wars, Prohibition, jazz, the lost generation, stock market crash, burning crosses of the Ku Klux Klan, Hitler's rise to power. An exciting cavalcade filmed in its actual locales. New England, the South...
In 1963, Otto Premier's The Cardinal opened at Hollywood's Egyptian Theatre, one of the largest commercial screens then in existence. And audiences and industry technicians were stunned, not because of the content of the film. And in research for this episode, I actually got hold of The Cardinal, and it's a film that I've never heard of before until I started researching this episode, and I don't really see much dialogue about it or reappraisals about the film. And it's about a 3-hour epic following a young man's rise through the Catholic Church from the end of the First World War through to the Second World War. And it's a fairly engaging film. It does ask some pertinent questions, I think, about faith and what it means, and I was quite moved by quite a lot of it. It's a bit schmaltzy for sure, and I found out that it's incredibly hard to actually get hold of on home video. I believe MGM put a DVD out of it, and I got hold of a German Blu-ray of the film. But audiences weren't stunned because of the film that they had watched. They were amazed because the film looked like a true 70mm epic. It was bright, razor sharp, clean, richly coloured, and overwhelmingly big. And everyone in attendance assumed it had been photographed on the prestigious 65 negative stock used for grand roadshow epics like Ben-Hur, Lawrence of Arabia, West Side Story, and Premier's own film, Exodus. But there was a twist to this, because The Cardinal was shot entirely on 35mm Panavision, and what audiences were witnessing was one of the earliest and most successful 35 to 70mm blow-ups ever created. So well executed that many viewers believed they were looking at a native 65mm production. And for the industry, this was something of a revelation. There had been blow-ups from 18 to 16 or 16 to 35, but from 35 to 70mm was another thing entirely. And to achieve that image that could be stand shoulder to shoulder with true 65mm photography was, for the time, something quite astonishing. Which is why, in this episode, we're going to look at the process and the history behind the 70mm blow-up film. And I'd like to add as well that this episode is kind of a companion piece to one in season 1 in which I did the history of Dolby Stereo, and there will be another episode on this topic, and it's all building for something that's going to be dropping in April. So this is kind of a series of shows dealing with this side of cinema history. So before we get to 75mm blow-ups, we're going to go back in time a little bit and look at the economics of the 70mm roadshow era. So we need to go back to the late 50s and 1960s, the period film historians often referred to as the roadshow boom. Cinema was changing rapidly in response to its biggest threat yet, television, and between 1947 and 1957, US cinema attendance dropped by more than 60%. Hollywood's answer was spectacle, formats and experiences that TV set could not provide. So that's why we gave rise to the widescreen formats: Cinerama, Todd AO, Super Panavision, Ultra Panavision, Super Technicolor, plus a variety of 35 widescreen formats: CinemaScope, VistaVision, Superscope, etc. These formats were enormously expensive, but they delivered the clarity, size and colour saturation audiences had never seen before. Todd AO and Panavision 70mm systems quickly proved the most commercially sustainable. They provided large format 65 negative with far more detail than 35mm, and 70mm release prints also had 6-track stereo. They had huge curved screens, seating that could be reserved in advance, and were limited to 1 or 3 screenings per day with premium ticket pricing. Roadshows were marketed like theatrical events comparable to opera or Broadway. By 1963, more than 1,100 cinemas worldwide had 70mm capability. Paris alone had a dozen 70mm venues, and almost every major city had at least one flagship 70mm palace. Manchester, where I live, actually had two, the Gaumont on Oxford Road and the Canon ABC on Deansgate, which has now been turned into a Wetherspoons. And I've heard a rumour that actually most of the cinema is actually intact at the back of the building. Oh, how I would love to buy that and convert it back to a 70mm cinema. So if anyone has a spare few £1 million they want to give me, I'm open to offers. But these installations cost theatres a fortune. New projectors, new screens, new sound system, and extensive architectural modifications were required. Studios sometimes subsidised these upgrades, but exhibitors needed a steady stream of 70mm product to justify the investment. And here is where the problem was. There was a bottleneck. There simply wasn't enough 70mm films being produced. Although the 65mm filigree was breathtaking, it was also heavy, expensive. Film stock cost between 3 to 4 times more than 35mm. It could be mechanically temperamental, was slow to reload, and required specialised training on equipment for crews. It was sustainable for biblical epics, musical and prestige dramas, but not for the dozens of mid-budget studio films that were needed each year. Meanwhile, theatres with 70mm screens found themselves increasingly playing ordinary 35mm prints, enlarged beyond their intended size, and the results were often grainy, soft, washed out, and for the punters, extremely disappointing theatrical experiences. It's quite reassuring to know actually that people in those days were still pissed off of going to the cinema, because God, I know I do. But audiences expected a spectacle, and exhibitors needed more 70mm product, and studios needed a way to supply it without tripling their budgets. So the solution to this came from 3 companies working in parallel: Panavision, Eastman Kodak and Technicolor. By the early 1960s, Panavision had emerged as Hollywood's dominant lens manufacturer, while Kodak continued to refine film stocks to deliver higher resolution and lower grain. Technicolor, meanwhile, possessed the most advanced optical printers and wet gate process in the world, and together the 3 developed a new, coordinated approach. First up was the ultra-fine grain 35mm Eastman stocks. In the early 1960s, Kodak introduced new colour negatives, notably 5250, 5251 and then 5254, which had finer grain, better definition and superior colour stability. They were the cleanest 35mm stocks that had ever been made up to that point. Panavision produced sharper 35mm lenses, which had minimal distortion, excellent sharpness, superior coatings and better colour uniformity. This meant the 35mm image was as crisp as possible prior to enlargement. And Technicolor developed optical blow-up and wet gate printing. Wet gate printing worked as follows. During the blow-up, the negative is submerged in the fluid with the same reflective index as the film base. This makes scratches, dust pits and abrasions optically invisible. The next process was to blow the image up, and Technicolor's blow-up printers preserved sharpness, contrast and colour fidelity. The result was a surprisingly clean, surprisingly sharp 70mm image, not truly equal to 65mm, but close enough that audiences could not tell. And we go back to the beginning with that premiere of the Cardinal, because it was shown in its first screenings in 70mm, and everyone in attendance was stunned. For the first time, a 35mm originated film had held its sharpness on a giant screen, had minimal grain, displayed rich colour, and featured full 6-track magnetic sound. And it looked to most observers like a true 65mm epic. And this single film proved that 70mm blow-ups were viable, and the roadshow crisis was effectively solved. Now, all this sounds like 70mm blow-ups were a kind of perfect solution to the problem, but there was an issue, and that was with aspect ratios, because 70mm prints required a 2.200 to 1 aspect ratio. Thus, scope films shot at 2:35:1 had their sides cropped, and flat films shot on 1:85:1 lost information at the top and bottom, and sometimes even the sides. Occasionally, projectionists even zoomed in 1:85 films to fill the width, causing soft images and missing framing. Critics did notice this, and filmmakers complained, and some projectionists even modified masking to fake a proper framing. A notorious example of this is Rocky III, whose 70mm frames accidentally eliminated crucial action at the sides. I suppose it's similar to what we would expect. We would have seen when pan and scanning was used to fill TV screens. Still, audiences often didn't know the difference, and I would definitely another example of an absolute aberration of a blow-up, and I've seen comparisons of it, was Gone with the Wind, which obviously was shot at the Academy ratio, and it was recropped to a 70mm frame, and it's incredible. I was actually considering trying to kind of screen the film and crop it out in that way, but I obviously decided to be a complete waste of time. But I just wanted to see for myself how much of a jarring experience it'd be. And there are screen grabs as well of the Rocky III 7mm blow, which are available online. Another evolution that was going on, the expansion of sound from mono to surround. And again, I would recommend you go back and listen to my Dolby stereo episode in the first season of 24 Frames Cast. So for most people going to the cinema before the mid-1970s, mono was pretty much the normal. A few select 70mm engagement offered a magnetic 6-track stereo. And early surround sound systems existed, but were still quite rare. I know on quite a lot of the CinemaScope films that I pick up, there's sometimes an option for a 4.0 surround track on them. But I have seen it for myself, which is the audio presentation of This Is Cinerama. And in mid-film, it kind of gives you a presentation of the sound system, which is 5 speakers behind the screen and 2 in the rear, essentially a kind of prototype 5.1 surround sound. But typically 35mm prints carried mono or sometimes 2-channel optical stereo, and as I said before, those experimental quadraphonic mixes. True 70mm magnetic sound was far superior, and one of the reasons why blow-up prints were so desirable. Again, I will reference my Dolby stereo episode in season 1, but Dolby Laboratories came into cinema and they transferred both the 35 and 70mm exhibition format. Of course, there was the first application of Dolby A reduction on A Clockwork Orange, and then we had Dolby Stereo in 1976, which, just as a reminder, was 4 channels encoded onto 2 optical tracks, left, right, centre and surround. So from 1976 onwards, though, we had the Dolby 70mm 6-track, which consisted of the following. Now, a traditional 70mm soundtrack consisted of a left channel, a left centre channel, a centre channel, a right centre channel, and a right channel and a surround channel. Dolby 70mm stereo consisted of a left, centre, right, and 2 low-frequency baby boom channels, essentially where all the low frequencies were contained, and a surround channel. And this created a cleaner, more powerful, some would say more modern sound field. The first film to use the format was Logan's Run in 1976, and a notable example of the system was in Superman in 1978, which used stereo surround sounds, a direct ancestor of the 5.1 we all enjoy today. More than 250 films used Dolby 70mm formats, especially prestige releases and major action spectacles. As someone who collects film posters, cinemas unable to run 70mm stereo often literally blacked out the logo, and I've got a few that actually have done this, and I think it's kind of a nice reminder, really, as to how kind of prestigious this format was. Once the 35mm blow-up became practical, studios saved enormous costs and cinema gained the 70mm event they needed. True 65mm productions declined sharply, and since 1963 fewer than 30 major films have been shot entirely on 65mm, whereas more than 250 had been blown up to 70mm. Multiplexing accelerated this trend in the late 60s and 70s. Large single screen palaces would split, or twinned as it was known as, into 2 or more auditoriums. Cinemas still kept at least one 70mm screen where possible, but it proved hard to justify large-scale native 65mm photography. The grander formats like Ultra Panavision 70, Super Panavision 70, Super Technorama and Todao slowly faded. In their place, we simply got 70mm as a generic premium experience, often a blow-up, not a true large format production. And by the 1980s, 70mm blow-ups were still popular, but increasingly served as prestige premieres or special engagement, festival screenings or IMAX alternatives. And by the 1990s, magnetic sound stripping costs skyrocketed, Dolby Digital arrived, and 70mm faded away. It's worth thinking back though, because once the process had proved itself with the Cardinal, Hollywood embraced it on a scale nobody anticipated. By the time the era came to an end in the 1990s, more than 250 films had been blown up from 35 to 70mm, far outnumbering the relatively small handful of movies shot on true 65 negative during the same period. And although the film prints have faded, warped or vanished over the decades, one more enormous part of the legacy survives perfectly intact, and that is sound. The multi-channel magnetic mixes created for those 70mm blow-ups, the massive 3 front channel arrays, the earlier stereo surrounds and the 2 baby boom bass channels have lived on. Many of these 6-track mixes are carefully transferred, preserved and remastered for home media, often forming the foundation of 5.1 and 7.1 soundtracks that we enjoy today. So if you put on certain Blu-rays or UHD that have a huge bass rumble, or hear discrete left or centre right imaging, or experience stereo sounds in films made long before home cinema was a thing, you're often hearing the heritage inherited from the 70mm era. And the legacy does also live on in cinemas. Events like the Widescreen Weekend at the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, the 70mm Film Festival in Karlsruhe in Germany, and the Roadshow Festival in Oslo, and the annual 70mm series at the American Cinematheque in Hollywood still draw audiences from around the world. People travel thousands of miles just to see films projected the way they were meant to be, large, louder and definitely more spectacular. And there is something quite impressive about sitting down to watch one of these films, as I have done when I visited the Widescreen Weekend in Bradford, and the images do feel even more epic than they normally would do. I remember seeing Aliens on 70mm and being completely blown away, so much so that I almost feel like my substance screenings just simply don't do it justice. And I think it did do something quite meaningful for cinema. Films that were never supposed to be seen that big were given the blow-up treatment. The economic reason for 70mm cinema was to keep cinema alive, and they succeeded admirably. And it's pleasing to see as well that there are filmmakers going back to these formats of Todao and 70mm, especially people like Paul Thomas Anderson. Even though I didn't like one battle after another, certainly the spectacle of it impressed me. I haven't also watched The Brutalist. Unfortunately, I wasn't around when it was showing at cinemas, but I understand the Todao screening and the 70mm blow-ups of that were incredibly impressive. So I still think 70mm will be with us for a long time. I think it's a wonderful thing that happened in cinema, and long may it continue. And to sort of round up, I thought I would pick some films, if you have got them, which do incorporate really decent 70mm 6-track elements into their soundtracks. And I did a bit of research, and you can go down a lot of Reddit and forum rabbit holes on the likes of IMDb and whatnot. So here's some recommendations that I'm going to give to you. Number 1 is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It certainly has the bass when the mothership arrives is absolutely rattles your fillings. Blade Runner, the final cut, the new Dolby Atmos soundtrack has been cobbled together apparently from elements from the 70mm blow up of that. Alien as well, really apparently from what I've been told is remarkably faithful to the original Dolby 6-track soundtrack on that. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, apparently that had quite a front-loaded soundtrack, and it's definitely there on this new version. I don't really like that film an awful lot, but there is no denying that the sound is absolutely off the charts. And of course, Apocalypse Now is another one. The Francis Ford Coppola himself apparently supervised a preservation of the 70mm6 track, and it just feels absolutely massive. Some other notable exceptions as well might be Logan's Run, which was the first film ever released in 70mm6 track. I've got this out there on Warner Archive Blu-ray. I think you can get it as part of the Premium collection from HMV in the UK. It's got a kind of very early experimental surround sound use, and the bass on this is actually kind of pre the kind of the baby boom era of bass, so it is a little bit more refined, but it still sounds pretty great. So that's going to be it. Let me know if you've actually seen any films in 70mm. I am going to put a link in this as well to a wonderful YouTube channel called The Movie Collector, and the host of that reviewing Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, because John has a brilliant kind of recollection of seeing that film on 70mm and hearing it. I think it was the first time he ever heard a film that had kind of like THX approved sound, and yeah, really great podcast channel anyway, but I will leave a link in that. And I'll also leave a link to the website in 70mm.com, which has an absolute wealth of material on this subject and is well worth having a read. So many thanks for listening, and I'll be back soon. Bye.